Well, the big story this evening, guarded on GDP growth, upbeat on fiscal headroom and wary of inflation. That, in the essence, is a summary of the 440-page economic survey which was tabled in Parliament today on the eve of the Union Budget. The survey, authored by Principal Economic Advisor Sanjeev Sanyal and his team, this after the former Chief Economic Advisor KV Subramaniam's term ended in December. Let's take you through some of the key highlights. The survey is expecting a GDP growth rate of 9.2% this year and is projecting a growth rate of 8 to 8.5% for the upcoming financial year. However, it points out that achieving this is contingent on a normal monsoon, no pandemic-related shocks, and orderly withdrawal of liquidity by global central banks, and oil prices staying below $75. The survey's GDP growth forecast is below the IMF's projection of 9% and the World Bank's projection of 8.7%. The Asian Development Bank expects GDP growth rate of 7.5%, which is below what the survey is projecting. The survey is optimistic on the fiscal roadmap. It says the government has fiscal space for additional spending if necessary, and that fiscal consolidation is on track. The point of concern that the survey red flags is inflation. It highlights the rise in input costs and global commodity prices, saying India needs to be wary of imported inflation. Well, joining us now to discuss the economic survey is its key author, Sanjeev Sanyal, the Principal Economic Advisor. Mr. Sanyal, always a pleasure. Many thanks for joining us here on CNBC-TV18, and congratulations on authoring the economic survey. Let me start by asking you about that. When did you start work on it?
Well, that's always a secret. No, I'm just kidding. Well, we do begin to work on this somewhere in October, when we begin to ask various departments to send in their inputs. And then, of course, it gathers pace through the course of November. But certainly by December, everybody is working hard at it, and all the economic advisors and consultants at the Ministry of Finance are hard at work by December. But this year was a particularly tricky one. As you know, we were understaffed because we didn't have our Chief Economic Advisor. And also, we had a lot of impact from Omicron. I mean, several of our key advisors and economists were down with it, or they had close family members who were down with it. So a lot of this work had to be done with people online. There were many people who used Dolo 650 to keep running through this period. So a lot of hard work in there that, I hope came together well in the end.
Well, Dolo 650 has delivered the goods for many, including for the authors of the economic survey, as is evident here. But Mr. Sanyal, let's talk about the projections that the survey is making, and let's address the growth projections of 8 to 8.5%. You do point out that this will depend on several factors. Oil prices staying between $70 to $75, an orderly taper that central banks are now starting to undertake, a normal monsoon, and of course, no nasty surprises as far as the pandemic is concerned. Now, where do you believe you see the most downside risks to this projection? Which are the most serious concerns to your mind, the most serious challenges to the recovery at this point?
So, as you know, any forecast, and particularly during an uncertain period, will have to be based on some assumptions. So rather than, try and sort of plug everything, we did a very simple thing. We provided a range, and then we provided you a clear, transparent set of assumptions so that you know what that view is based on. So let's go through those assumptions. I think a normal monsoon is not an unreasonable assumption. There's no particular reason why it should not be a normal monsoon. It's not an El Nino year as far as we know. Similarly, we talked about there being a taper. So we have taken into account a significant taper in there, which I think is to be expected. The Fed has signaled it and so on. So I think that's fair to take that into account. But on the other hand, they have, I don't think it'll be too disorderly, given that everybody now expects it. Similarly, we have talked about global supply chains slowly coming back. So for much of next year, we continue to accept, disruptions on the supply chain, but improving over time. So again, I don't think that's an unreasonable expectations. Oil in the 70 to 75%, $75 range. Well, I know somebody will point out, oh, it's at 90 right now. But let me say that just 18 months ago, it was below 20. So, I'm not in the business of predicting oil prices, and nor should you be in. It's a very dangerous profession. But the fact is, I think 70 to 75 is a reasonable range. Fact is, if it goes too far above that range and stays at this 90 range, what will happen? You will begin to see central banks respond by tightening things even further. And consequently, there are balancing factors that will begin to show through. Growth will slow. And so, it will drift back. So I would say that 70 to 75 seems like a reasonable range. Of course, we could be wrong, but we could be wrong in either direction.
Yes, those are some of the risk factors to this projection that you've highlighted. Let me address the issue of revenue collection, because that clearly has been the silver lining through the course of the year, both as far as direct taxes are concerned as well as indirect taxes. As you look ahead, what are you factoring in as far as revenue growth is concerned? Specifically because that big largesse that we saw on account of excise, we've already seen a reduction. The expectation is that perhaps the government may bite the bullet again to try and spur consumption and demand. So what should we realistically expect in terms of revenue going forward?
Well, that is the prerogative of the finance minister to present in a few hours' time. So I will not go in there. My discussion in the economic survey is based on publicly available data between April and November. And as you all know, tax revenues went up very, very sharply during that period. Yes, it is true that the excise component of it will be, obviously, with those tax cuts on fuel, that will lose some momentum. But I think most of the other categories are doing very well as far as we can tell. But yes, you will have to wait for a few more hours to find out what our plans are into the future. That is, of course, the prerogative of the finance minister.
Yes, it is the prerogative of the finance minister. But do you believe that, a further cut in excise is something that the government will need to consider to spur demand and boost consumption?
Well, the key theme of the economic survey is agile policymaking, i.e. being responsive to the situation as it evolves. So that remains the guiding principle even going forward. So should the situation so require, we will do that. But as I said, in a few hours' time, you will find out what our assessment is on that, all these issues, and what the new budget will do.
Yes, you have highlighted that agile policy making should be the thrust of policy making going forward. But, let's address the issue of fiscal space and fiscal headroom, because through the course of the survey, you do talk about the fact that because you've seen a much better picture as far as revenue is concerned, there is fiscal space and fiscal headroom for more government intervention if it were to be necessary. Now, the Vice Chairman of the Niti Aayog in his conversation with me believes that there is significant, in his words, significant fiscal space available. Can you explain to us how much headroom you believe the government has to play around with, especially in light of the fact that the RBI and the MPC may be more constrained now?
Well, I mean, the data that we have presented clearly shows that both the fiscal deficit and the primary deficit for the months of April to November are not merely below what they were during the pandemic-affected year of 2021, but even compared to pre-pandemic year, which was 1920, both the deficits, fiscal and primary, are significantly lower. That is also true in terms of where they are placed vis-a-vis the budget trajectory that is usually done. So I would argue that there is fiscal space. Now, how that it is utilized, well, we have signaled in the past that a key way of doing it is using it through for creating infrastructure, and infrastructure spending has been a key driver of recovery. If necessary, we will do more of that, and that has been the strategy thus far and signaled quite clearly ahead. As far as exactly how it will pan out, as I said, into the next year, well, as I said, you will have to simply wait for a few more hours.
That is going to be the standard caveat, I would imagine, through the course of this conversation. But that's understandable. Yes, you said that CapEx is going to have to be a focus area, a thrust area for the government, and it will need to continue to do the heavy lifting in terms of spending there. But let's talk about the unorganized sector, the informal sector, where pain continues. And the finance minister has spoken about the need to perhaps look at relief for sectors like the contact-based sectors, the MSMEs, etc. What kind of intervention, in light of the measures already taken, do you believe are needed there? Is it likely to be a continuation of the measures announced already, for instance, an extension of the ECLGS scheme, or should we expect the need for different interventions today?
So, well, as made perfectly clear in the economic survey, as well as in the presentation a few hours ago, contact-based services, not surprisingly at all, have been particularly hit by this COVID situation. Hotels, entertainment, and those kinds of sectors, travel, are obviously sectors that, every time there's a lockdown or a disruption of some sort, restrictions are placed on this directly. So not surprisingly, they get affected. And of course, it's not just once, it's happened repeatedly, stop-go kind of thing. So this is clearly a sector, in fact, we present that this is one of the one sector that has actually not reverted back to pre-COVID levels, even though the overall economy is now back to pre-COVID, above pre-COVID levels, in fact. The contact-based services are certainly still below. And, as I said, we'll find out if there are new policies that can be put in place to help them. But let me say, as a general point, that in the end, the thing that this sector needs is simply being open and being allowed to have a free road to grow. It's not really a lack of demand in many cases in these sectors. We're simply not getting a long free road to expand again. And that will only happen when the health concerns relating to COVID have been brought under control. Now, in this context, let me add that vaccination is a very big plus. For whatever it's worth, the last 1 year, a lot of effort was put in. Most of us have now got our second dose. And some are even going into a third dose. I would argue, and this is something I have even assumed in my forecast, that I think we are in a good place as far as thinking about this pandemic is concerned. Of course, new waves may come, but I think it is fair to say that with all this vaccination, the economic disruptions you saw in the past are unlikely now.
Well, that certainly is the hope that the severity of the pandemic is...
Yeah. Sorry, I was just saying that you will have to go on to your last question because I have to move on to another interview after this.
Okay. So let me then ask you about, areas where we are likely to see the government being weighed down. It seems pretty clear that at least as far as food and fertilizer subsidies are concerned, there will have to be a significantly higher outlay as far as FY23 is concerned. The number we will know in the budget tomorrow. But, what do you believe are going to be the factors that will constrain government spending, that will weigh on the finance minister's mind, and that could potentially weigh on the economy and recovery?
Well, clearly, as you have seen in the economic survey as well, imported inflation is a key issue. But there are many potential things that could happen. There are geopolitical risks bubbling up in East Asia and in Eastern Europe. So these are all kinds of things that are difficult to predict. And in fact, the whole thesis of the economic survey is that we live in an uncertain, unpredictable world. So the real key to economic strength and policy making is ultimately the ability to be flexible and be able to respond to the unpredictable rather than to have some grand plan. So if you read the economic survey, there's a lot of emphasis laid on the issue of agile policy making, on safety nets, the barbell strategy of how to combine different strategies in order to deal with uncertainty, supply side reforms, the need for Atmanirbhar resilience. So if you look at all these themes, what do they have in common? It's all about dealing with uncertainty.
One final question. Since we're talking about uncertainty and we're talking about agile policy making, one of the big asks that's come in from all quarters is that the government ought to consider an NREGS kind of support scheme for the urban unorganized workers. Now, the Labour Ministry has put together data as part of its Shram portal. I don't know whether this is something the government is considering, but should the government consider something like this?
As I said, it is difficult for me to speak on any specific new project on the eve of the budget. So let me leave it there.
Okay, I'll try and read between the lines. You said new project on the eve of the budget. I don't know if that's an indication of anything to come or a sign of things to come. But we will leave it there and wait to tomorrow. Sanjeev Sanyal. I get that. But I appreciate you joining us here on CNBC-TV18, and many thanks for your time. We'll speak with you again tomorrow, but thanks very much for joining us here this evening.
Thank you.